can do a lot of things like that. Not that I would have been drinking coffee anyway, but beside the point. I even taking things like transport, I avoided car trips, anything like that. It was just, it's not like I ever said to anybody, yeah, I'm not going to come with you because I can't sit in the car. Like, that would be insane. I'd never say that to someone. I would just make excuses. Oh no, I'm going to make my own way, it's okay. Oh, I prefer the fresh air, I'm going to walk. All of this stuff. I prefer to stand because it gives me a bad back when I sit down. So I'm going to stand. I would just make excuses that people wouldn't question. As you can imagine, not being able to sit down and having to run for 6 hours a day is quite limiting. It's quite limiting on your life. Not everybody looks like that. I'd say the majority of people that have compulsive movement don't look like that. It can be just the sort of having to work out every day can definitely be a huge red flag. But the stuff that's overlooked is not even the working out. It's what I call lower level movement. And that is just really the inability to sit still, the anxiety that comes up with sitting still, being the person that's always like, oh, I'll get up and go and get that. So if you're at home with someone and you're noticing that they can't sit and just watch a movie for the duration of the movie, they kind of have to be up and down, and they're sort of making excuses that you think are weird to go up the stairs and get something from upstairs. This is one thing that I used to do if I was sat down. I'd make excuses. I've just got to go and get that pen. Oh, I've got to go and get a glass of water now. I really couldn't sit still for very long, and I'd go into the same room multiple times rather than collecting all the items that I needed at once and then going and sitting back down. It's also, for me, it was also highly competitive with other people that didn't know that they were in the competition. How stuff can be competitive, right? Yeah, right, I'm running longer than that person. Yeah, fine. But I was competitive about stuff like, if one of you went up and went to the toilet, I'd have to get up and go to the toilet, even if I didn't need to go. That's crazy. And half the reason that you don't talk about this stuff is because it's insane. If you start telling people about this stuff, they're going to put you away. Like, that's insane that you would do that. I used to get up and go, and if I didn't need to go to the toilet, I'd just go and stand in there for a second, maybe do some jumping jacks and then come back out. It's like an itch that I needed to scratch. If someone else moved, I had to get up and move. It's like I couldn't not do it. And the problem with it is, it's like with any compulsion thing, it doesn't leave you alone. Just keep, get up. And it's just so much easier a lot of the time to be like, fine, I'll get up and walk into the bathroom. Now I'll sit down, I'll be all right for a little bit. But so these are the little things that you might notice about somebody that changes. Because I tell you what, before I had an eating disorder, I could sit for hours and watch TV. And I'd be like, Mum, can you bring me hot chocolate? Can you bring me some toast? Like, that was not me. I was not this kind of like up and downy type person. The other thing that lower level movement happens really often is cleaning. And the reason that most of us go for cleaning is because it's so excusable. And everybody likes a clean house, and everybody respects someone that keeps stuff really clean. So, vacuuming is moving. That made me feel okay. It was something I was doing. I was occupying myself. And you end up in a clean place. So this is where it gets difficult. It's because it's difficult to walk into someone's house and say, you need to vacuum less often. Stop doing the cleaning. Be a slob. Because that's not what our culture does. But with people with eating disorders, another aspect, the mental aspect, is this kind of aiming, just this what I call this martyr effect that comes in. You've always got to be doing stuff. You've always got to be the person that's moving the most, eating the least, being good, clean house, all of these things, doing things for other people. That really often comes in. And I don't think that that's really any surprise if you think about it, if it's an evolved response. It's kind of like, if food is short and you're migrating, you have to be really damn productive to stay alive. And so most of us have this kind of weird productivity drive. We always have to be doing something. We can't just be sitting down and watching a movie. It's got to be like, oh, I've got to be doing something productive the whole time. All right, so where are we? Any questions on compulsive movement? Yeah.
This, excuse me, hi. This is only if things change into this. So if it's a child for as long as you can remember who just cannot stop moving, this is not what you're talking about, right?
I think so, yes.
Okay.
Because while I could easily and now still can sit on my ass for hours and be really, really happy. As a child, I was always kind of, active, riding horses, doing stuff like being outside. Still am that person now. But as a child and as a teenager, hell no would you find me in the gym. That was just not me. But when I had an eating disorder, I lived in the gym. And I actually stopped doing the things that I loved because stuff like horse riding wasn't actually movement enough for me. I'd rather be running because that's more. So I actually stopped horse riding in that time and just focused on running, which I hate, by the way. I think to do forever. Yeah, that's a great question.
This might have to do with kind of the environment meeting the predisposition almost, but growing up, I know I was always one of the planner types. I liked structure, and I liked anything I could do that was like, oh, well, if I'm doing this, I can also make it productive, make the time productive. So if you're sitting down watching TV, okay, I'm going to do 100 sit-ups between commercial breaks, or okay, I'm going to sit in the splits and stretch while I'm watching TV. Or when I'm in the grocery line, like I'm going to be doing doming with my arches like crazy, and I look back on it now and I'm like, oh my goodness, what was that? But how do we as coaches help? Because I still think I as a coach have a tendency to be like, yeah, sit, stretch in the splits while you're watching TV, but how do we... What's the line there in terms
That's
of
a really good question. I don't think there's a really easy answer to that. I think it's just sort of, because for many people, many people do need a little bit more to be a little bit more productive.
Right.
It's just usually people with eating disorders take that and run with it to the point that it's destructive. And it's really, non-productive time is very important for humans as well. We all need that. We all need time where we just do nothing. And so I think, just knowing your students well, I guess. Okay. And there's plenty of other signs as well. That productivity increase is not the only thing that, so it's just bringing it all together, I think, and maybe talking to the parents as well, noticing if things have changed. Yeah. Any other questions?
I do. The majority of what we talk about today are sort of after the awareness of the behavior being unusual. Yeah. Right? I'm more intrigued about your experience where you didn't realize until later on that these behaviors were unusual.
Mm-hmm.
Where it kind of sneaks up on you, right?
Mm-hmm.
What were the...
I know, and this is why this is one of the primary reasons eating disorders are so difficult, because it's not as if one day my eating disorder jumped up and said, "Hi, got anorexia, welcome to hell." It doesn't happen like that. It happens really, really gradually, and it's not. A lot of people talk about like eating disorder thoughts, eating disorder voices. For me, it was never a voice. It's just feeling. I just feel like I have to run. I just feel like I just don't want to eat that. It really never, and the feeling never really presented itself as fear either. One of the key things for me in my recovery was understanding that my aversion to eating chocolate cookies, things that I'd eaten plenty of without anorexia, it wasn't actually because I was trying to be healthy. It wasn't because I was better than people that ate chocolate cookies. It was because I was scared of them. And actually for me that's so important because I hate being scared of things. So when I realised I was scared of it, I was like, I'm damn well eating those chocolate cookies. You have to force themselves while I'm sitting there crying, which I was. And so the problem is the progression is always just this feeling, it's an inclination, which again calls to that biological genetic drive. There are many things that we do that are driven biologically that don't make any logical sense. Having children is a perfect example. That does not make any logical sense. Come on, it's so expensive, and it means your life is over. That doesn't make any logical sense. It's a biological drive though, and you can't fight it. So, like biological stuff is really, really usually happens gradually, and usually just feels like a feeling. I just feel like I want to have kids, which I've never had. But so that's why it's so problematic. It usually happens relatively gradually, and there's usually a lot of resistance once that's started to happen to changing. And my compulsive exercise didn't start with 6 hours a day. It started with like, yeah, maybe I should do some ab stuff. That's what everyone else does. That's what I started with. So But then you just builds and it builds, and it's never enough, and it's never enough. It's the same with the weight loss. It started with, got to lose 5 pounds to ride that horse. And then it's not enough, and it goes more and more and more. And so, yeah, this is why eating disorders are hard. This is why they're really deadly as well, because they usually just suck you in before you know it. And then you only really know that something's really bad is happening when it's awful. And by the time it's awful, it's really difficult to pull back out.
I have one last follow-up.
Yeah.
It's in a slightly different area, but with our younger kids, they would say things like, "Oh, I just don't feel very good. I feel lightheaded," or "Oh, my stomach hurts," or whatever. Not associating that sensation with an energy deficit, or with the actual act of feeling hungry.
Yeah.
So I guess my question is, if those sensations aren't defined, is that something that also contributes to the energy deficit?
Oh, absolutely.
Habits,
And what the protectionary elements of the brain. If you think about it from your brain's point of view, your brain's just like, there's not enough food here. This mammal has to migrate. This mammal's got to go. And so what the brain starts to do is your brain doesn't want you getting worried about, I should stop moving because I'm losing weight. Your brain's like, you just ignore that, just ignore that. So our brains start to kind of like buffer us from the reality of our situation, which is why people with eating disorders often don't see themselves as thin as they are. Because the brain's like, don't worry about that, just keep moving. And it's the same with the pain threshold. I know that when I had anorexia, my pain threshold was incredibly high. I could have all sorts of injuries. How would I stop running? I would keep running on all of these injuries. If a bird is migrating, it can't stop flying because it got tired. So I think our pain thresholds also got really high. And so a lot of the things is like it's not that we're necessarily willfully trying to self-destruct. Some people do, but not everyone. But a lot of the time your brain is kind of buffering you from the reality of what's going on with your body, which is another reason why they're so difficult. Which is another reason why it's so great to have some awareness for the signs so that you can see stuff early on. Any other questions before we move on? Yeah.
I don't know if I'm going to phrase this right. So in your process, your personal process, at what point were you aware that you had an issue? And then
Really late on.
at that point, did you ignore it? And I mean, I guess like if you see an awareness that you might have an eating disorder, and you recognize it in yourself, but is it possible to do something at that point?
Absolutely.
Or does it just...
It depends on the person, but for sure. I actually was probably around 8 years in before I even really knew I had anorexia, and all of that is because I didn't think I was the type of person that had anorexia. And my perception of the person that had anorexia was a supermodel wannabe, and I didn't identify with that one bit, and I didn't want anything to do with it. So if anybody suggested it, I was just like, I'm not that type of person. I ride horses, I'm a tomboy, this is who I identify with. I do not identify with this vain, silly person that has anorexia. So that's why the stigma's so difficult. And for me, actually, as soon as I understood that I had anorexia, that was actually like, oh heck, I've got to fix this. I've got to sort this out. And that I really then did. But that did coincide with the time that I was heavily suicidal and was just at the end of the road with it anyway. So everybody's different. I've worked with plenty of people that really early on have understood they have anorexia and that have also really struggled to recover. I've worked with plenty of people who have recovered really well, who have not been at rock bottom. There's no kind of it really depends on the person, it's very individual, it's like any other sort of illness in terms of recovery and how you get there. Okay, any other questions? Yeah?
Does it have to come with this compulsive movement?
No. But the majority of cases do, but no, it doesn't have to. No.
Well, I have a real quick question. So natural body weight, how do you quantify that?
Well,
so there's a spectrum, and so someone's natural, how do you figure that out?
I guess when that person is kind of eating adequately, moving adequately, not necessarily compulsively. I think that all of us genetically probably predisposed also have this sort of movement threshold that's normal for us. my husband moves relatively little, but his whole family are like that, and he's really healthy. Whereas my whole family are kind of more just the type of people that go out for walks and do stuff, and we all just do that. So I do actually think that what defines what's healthy for that person is largely genetic as well, and so it's a difficult question to answer. But so not sort of suppressing them, not actively restricting, not doing things that are their sort of like that they're having to do in order to maintain a lower body weight. And I think it's always a range as well. Like my weight is different every day, I'm sure. So it's and I think that seasonally, I think that our body weights change as well, which makes perfect sense. And so I think it's going to be a range, but I know that this is the body I had before I had anorexia, and this is also the body that my dad has. Not the exact same one. We don't share it, but you know, like if I look through my family, we all kind of look like this. This is where I would slot in. When I had anorexia, I didn't look like this. I really stood out like a sore thumb. And if my husband's family, they all look slightly differently. And if he looked like this, something would probably be really wrong with him. I mean, yeah, literally. But you know, if I'm talking about if he was still a guy, and he looked like this, he'd be heavily restricting, I think. So it's really difficult to define. But I think what we have to take into account, especially because as I worked as a personal trainer when I was sick, and my speciality was helping people lose weight. And you've got to kind of look at the whole big picture, and that includes their family genetics, and what does the rest of this person's family look like? Because if the rest of this person's family are not skinny, this person wasn't designed to be skinny. We've got to kind of like take a much bigger picture into account, and that's why body diversity and accepting that it's a thing. I mean, like really accepting that it's a thing, not saying, oh yeah, body diversity, I get that, but everybody should still be skinny. That's not accepting body diversity. Actually really accepting the body diversity as a thing, and that people can be healthy at all different size bodies. That's a health at every size approach. All right, so I've got a bit here on purging on the second sheet. I think it's important to understand that purging doesn't just have to be your typical bulimia, vomiting, laxatives. There's all these different ways to purge. I think I saw my compulsive exercise as a purging as well. Like that definitely made me feel like, oh, you know, I've got rid of whatever I just ate. So purging can become a compulsive behaviour, and purging all of the ways is really bad for you, especially purging by vomiting. It's really dangerous, and I think that most people who have anorexia start out kind of heavily restricting, and then what happens is, differs for everyone. Most of us can heavily restrict for about a year, maybe give it a year. And then what happens is the biology is just like, oh no, you cannot keep doing this. So what happens is your biology takes over and you binge. You lose control for a second and you've eaten a whole chocolate cake before you know it. And then you kind of freak out because it's like, oh my God, now what do I do? And so for most of us, then our problem-solving, really intelligent brains go, I need to purge and just get rid of that, and that can be by vomiting, it can be by exercise, it can be take multiple ways. So we purge. For me, that was always exercising and restriction. So I'd eat a load of food, lose control, eat a load of food, and then the next day I wouldn't eat hardly anything and I'd exercise a ton. So then what happens is your body goes, you're not listening to me, and it does it again. It binges, and you eat a load of food, and you go like, oh shit, I ate a load of food, I can use purge again. And then the body starts shouting at you louder, you're not listening to me, and the binges get bigger, which means that the purging gets bigger or the exercise gets bigger. And then what happens is a behavioural cycle occurs where people are binging and purging. That's bulimia, binge purge. And so that's why I see restrictive eating disorders as all under the same umbrella, because most of us binge and purge in some way. If you have anorexia, you can't really maintain straight restriction for a while. At some point your biology just goes like up yours, I'm going to eat. And so then we have to we make up for that. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so it can look really different, and for some people they binge and then they just straight out restrict. They don't actually purge, they just restrict the next day. But traditionally, the binge is always seen as the problem. That is the problem. You lose control over food and the binge is the problem. And binges, by the way, can happen in all size bodies. So when I was desperately overweight, I was also binging, but I was compulsively exercising, restricting afterwards, so I didn't gain any weight. People in much larger bodies do this as well. But when you're in a larger body, no one sees the restriction, all they see is the binge. They go, see, that's why you're overweight. You eat too much. I was binging when I was underweight. And so this is true throughout all body sizes. The binge is never the problem. The binge is the body trying to protect itself from the restriction. And to me, it's crazy that that's not obvious. That's why binges happen. It's not because somebody doesn't have control or that they're greedy. It's their body trying to protect itself from restriction. And anybody that's ever binged knows that it's not that nice. Like, you basically start eating and then you get really full and you continue eating to the point where you just feel so sick. It's not even physically nice. And it's not like you're tasting the food either. You go way past that point. And so it's nothing to really do with being greedy or losing control or any of those things. For me, it always just felt like this my biology just completely took over and I had no choice. Just felt completely that I had no choice. It's also not particularly nice. If you think about it from your body's point of view, that's not an optimal way to eat. To just shovel everything in at once and make itself have to digest all of that and make itself uncomfortable. That's not optimal. Your body doesn't want to do that. It's doing it out of desperation, because that is the response to any mammal that thinks it's in famine. When food is available, it's going to eat a lot of it. That's normal, that's optimal. And so I think that one of the biggest problems in the treatment field of eating disorders is people are told binging is bad. Don't binge. The binging is just your body doing its thing. Let it. Try and survive. What the problem is the restriction. And anybody that's binged and purged, or binged and restrict, or any of that, knows that the most difficult thing in the world after a binge is to resume eating. To not restrict is really damn hard. Because you're scared away again. And so that's the bit that's really important to understand, is that if somebody is binging, it's for a reason. Nobody wants to do it. It's biologically driven. Never make a big deal out of the binge, because they already feel really bad about it. They're already beating themselves up about it. Never make a big deal out of the binge. Make a big deal out of the restriction that caused the binge. Problem solved. And again, coming back to restriction doesn't have to look like straight out starvation. So somebody can be eating 3 meals a day, but if they are not eating what their body's really asking them for. So if they, it's lunchtime and their body's asking them for a cheeseburger and they're like, I'm going to take a salad, and they're doing that every day. At some point their body's going to say, I want the damn cheeseburger and I'm taking it, and a load of other stuff, because you're not listening. That's a binge. And so restriction doesn't have to look severe in order for it to actually cause binge episodes. And so that is important again for working with people that aren't in super thin bodies and aren't restricting massively but are still binging. Because it's the point of helping them also understand that they are actually restricting. It's just culturally acceptable. And that's the problem. But the binge is a symptom of restriction in the vast majority of cases. Yeah.
When someone's in recovery and they're eating well, but they get to that place where they want to eat more, the feast eating after.
Yeah.
Can you go into
That's
that?
why I call it feast eating, because binging is considered a bad thing. So I prefer to label it feast eating. And most of us in recovery go through a period where basically we want to eat the entire world all at one time. That's really normal. And that's actually, if you think about migrating animals, what happens when they get to the place that they're supposed to be going is they eat a ton of food for a while. They don't get there and go like, well, I'm just going to limit it to like 3 meals and 3 snacks today and be really careful about it. They get there and they just eat a load of food. And that's normal. That's the feast that follows the famine. Feasting is really, really, really optimal after a period of famine. But I still haven't got to the signs and symptoms yet, so I want to get to that because I think that might also help you understand what the mental state is doing and why the mental state is actually a lot of the time leading towards the extreme hunger. Okay. Physical symptoms, being relatively brief on this, but weight loss, yeah, I guess most people get that one. Loss of menstrual cycle. This is tricky, not always. Important to understand, not always. I've known people that incredibly hospitalized, low BMIs still getting their periods. So not always, but majority of the time. Hair loss, that's a gradual one over time, you notice hair thinning. Also hair growth, I got covered in this really weird hair all over my body. And so that's actually fetal hair, and it's your body trying to protect itself from the cold, I think, due to often the weight loss. Feeling cold is a really uncomfortable physical symptom of an eating disorder. I was cold the entire time. I was cold in the summer. I was just painfully cold forever, and it was very tiring. You know, it's tiring being cold. Okay, so IBS type symptoms. As I said, malnutrition, not having enough energy resources, affects every system in your body. It does affect the digestive tract. It affects your digestive system. And what happens most commonly is something called delayed gastric emptying, which is one of your body's attempts to lower metabolism, because your body's really smart. So if your body's like, there's not enough energy coming in, first thing it's going to do is it's going to try and lower its output. And that's what lowering metabolism is. It's lowering its output. And it does this by, a lot of people talk about metabolism like it's this thing to aim for. Yeah, high metabolism's good, low metabolism's bad. Like a low metabolism is, for example, if you own a house and you've got kids and there's, like all this stuff that goes on in your house, and then you lose your job. And so you say to everybody, guys, we've got to cut down, you've got to start turning the lights off, I only want you to flush the toilet once a day, like all of this stuff, we're gonna turn all these things in, we're not gonna put the heating on anymore. That's how you lower the output of your house. It's not optimal though, is it? It's not fun. And even more so in your body, it's much worse than that, because your body has all of these organs and these systems to upkeep. Even while you're sitting there, your body's doing stuff right now that you don't even have a clue about. You don't even know. And every single organ requires energy to run. And so when we're not eating enough, all of those things are just not having quite enough upkeep, not quite enough care. And this is why organ failure is so common in eating disorders. But so delayed gastric emptying is something your body, very clever, says, well, there's not even that much food coming through, so I don't need to empty the stomach quite as frequently, empty the stomach less. And so that can lead to things like bloating when we do eat, and feeling really full really quickly when we do eat. And there's research at the moment also going into what happens in the gut when we have an eating disorder, and sort of like the microbiota in there get fewer and less diverse, so that means you get more bloating, more gas. So all of these symptoms of IBS are very common in restrictive eating disorders. The problem is that the person who's experiencing them then sort of blames the food and goes like, well, I should obviously eat less gluten because I'm not digesting it very well. Well, the reason you're not digesting it very well is because your digestive system doesn't have enough energy. So eating less energy is going to be the last thing that's going to help with that. And this is also really misunderstood by a lot of doctors and nutrition professionals as well, because I took a nutrition qualification when I was sick. We weren't taught about eating disorders. We certainly weren't taught about the effects of starvation on the body. It's all about the opposite stuff. It's all you're taught about is like people that are overeating. You're not taught actually how to understand what happens when you're undereating. So bradycardia, I have that. And when I was at university, I lived with 3 medical students, and they used to lie me on the floor, and then they used to sit there and like watch my low heart rate and just be like, how the hell are you still alive when I was sick? And they thought it was kind of cool and funny. I guess I thought it was kind of cool and funny as well, because I was completely ignorant. Bradycardia is not cool and funny. It's a real problem. Anemia. Brain atrophy, here's one that most people don't consider with eating disorders. Your brain actually shrinks, and it can shrink by something like 17%, I think, and I think the Minnesota starvation study actually uncovered that. So that grain matter dies off. That's kind of severe. Hypoglycemia, talking about severe. So you might think of like, oh, you get these little dizzy spells, a little bit low blood pressure. Everyone gets those, right? And so I used to think of those sort of things, sometimes feeling a bit woozy, a bit kind of spacey. It's just like, everyone gets those sometimes, just stood up too quickly. Hypoglycemia is really problematic if it's prolonged, and there's research now that's linking hypoglycemia to heart failure and such a high rate of heart failure in people with anorexia. So as I said, malnutrition affects every system and organ in the body. Does anybody have any questions on that before I got onto the mental state stuff? Okay, all right. So this is the stuff that you can start to pick up on. You can't see if somebody's heart rate is too slow, because, unless you're a doctor. But most doctors are like, oh, good for you, you're really fit. So it's not always good either. You can notice personality changes, and for me, my personality changes were pretty severe, and I'd say that they happened quite quickly at the onset. They got worse and worse as I got more into my eating disorder. But I was a really social person as a teenager. I was always the one that was poking jokes, laughing, kind of, you know, like, just, I was never the person that would say no to a party. I was quite fun, actually. And I'd say that even in that first couple of months, that started to close down. It would just started to be like, no, I don't want to do that, I don't want to do this. I didn't really understand myself why, but I just knew I didn't feel like doing that stuff as well. I became very irritable, it wasn't as fun. These sorts of things I think you can really notice. I became very impatient, and that got really, really bad as my OCD element of my disorder got worse, because I just always had something to do. I was always on an agenda. It was one boom, 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 one thing after another. Move, 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 go, go, go. I couldn't stop and talk to people. People were annoying, especially if they wanted to stop and talk to me. The one thing that is really, really, I have to say that happens to all of us that restrict food for a prolonged period of time, and is a key symptom of energy deficit, is what I call mental hunger. So physical hunger can be non-existent when you have a restrictive eating disorder. I actually put that down to a sort of famine thing as well, because if your body thinks you need to migrate and it doesn't want you to be thinking about food the whole time and, you know, like physically disabled by it, it's not going to physically give you hunger cues. And the other thing is that physical hunger cues are expensive to the body, and if your body's really low on energy, why would it waste energy giving you a physical hunger cues, which requires a contraction, muscular contraction, when it doesn't think there's much food around? So, and there's also many biological reasons why physical hunger cues aren't present always when we have an eating disorder. But what most of us experience is mental hunger, and that comes out in constantly thinking about food. And for many of us, it can be quite deceiving, because yes, sometimes I was thinking about food like I would build chicken sandwiches in my head and imagine myself eating them and fantasize about food. But a lot of the time it came out in my food planning, and actually me planning my restrictive food. I was still thinking about food. A lot of the times it would come out in me planning my workout so that I was then allowed to eat, which is still in a long way around. It's thinking